find it. We came.
It's just a puzzle box!
Oh no. It is a means to summon us.
Who are you?
Explorers in the further regions of experience. Demons to some, angels to others.
It was a mistake! I didn't mean to open it! It was a mistake! You can... Go to hell!
We can't. Not alone. You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us. Taste our pleasures.
Please, go away and leave me alone.
Oh, no tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering.
You're listening to the ScareHouse podcast. I am your host, Rob Johnston, and today we have an interview with none other than horror movie legend Doug Bradley, who played Pinhead in the series of Hellraiser movies. Our very own Scott Simmons sat down with Mr. Bradley at the first ever Scare Camp back in early June 2011.
Please welcome the Dark Prince of Pain, the Angel of Suffering, Leviathan's Lord of the Damned, Mr. Doug Bradley.
Okay.
Grab the mic right there.
This one?
Yes.
I think I'm scared of myself right now.
So, welcome to Pittsburgh, and
Thank you.
our very innovative and labyrinthian traffic patterns.
Yes, I don't know whether you've heard. I apologize for being slightly late. My girlfriend got pulled over by our friends in blue. Where's the camera? God bless them. We love you. Thank you.
Have you ever done that moment of, do you know who I am? When you're getting pulled over in a situation like that?
It occurs to you. I didn't say that to Steph, but I was thinking, do you know who you've got sitting here? This guy didn't look like the kind who was going to be impressed by anything. If I told him I was Jesus Christ and I'd got the dates mixed up from May the 21st. And I had an urgent appointment with several billion people. And you're staying right here, buddy. No rapture for you. He would not have been impressed.
Maybe if you throw down some Steelers references, that does help you out around here.
I was at PNC Park last night. I could have done that.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about those Pirates, eh? Yeah. It was my first visit to PNC Park. You can keep the Steelers. American football is just a very, very silly game. I'm a devotee of football. I want to start a campaign to have American football rebranded as throwball. Because it's got nothing to do with feet. Apart from the guy who gets paid $1 million a season to come on the field and kick it twice a game. And PNC Park is a beautiful park. Absolutely gorgeous. And the thing I knew about the Pirates is that they are the losingest team in Major League Baseball history. So they didn't disappoint me last night. I actually really would have been disappointed if they'd won, because they're not supposed to do that. But, I look forward to be going to PNC Park more often.
Yes. So, let's get into it a little bit. Even before Pinhead and back in the 80s with Hellraiser, have you always been a horror fan? Was that part of your makeup when you were growing up?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. As a kid, it was ghosts stories, ghost movies. And then as a teenager in Liverpool, Granada Television started showing a horror film every Monday night, 10:30 after the news at 10. There would be a horror film on, and that was where I really got the horror bug. It was all the classic Hammer films, from there I moved on to discovering Vincent Price and Boris Karloff and etc. So yeah, always was a horror fan, and I still am a horror fan.
Now, I mean, what do you think it is when we say the Hammer films and those early films? I think they just have a different sense to it. What do you think it is that made not just the movies, but the actual performances of people like Boris Karloff, Lon Chaney, Vincent Price? What makes them resonate with audiences even now?
Wow, it's a good question. Read my book, and then you'll. I actually titled the last chapter in the book from something that a journalist wrote in, I think, a photo play on an article about Boris Karloff, and they used the phrase perennial in the human soul, and I think that's the answer. Horror is a genre that is never it's never out of print. It's always there. It's been, you go right back to the birth of cinema. From the day somebody was picking up a camera to make a movie, they were making fantasy films, they were making horror films. The most adapted work of fiction in the history of cinema. Does anybody know? It's not that well-known work of fiction, the Bible, by the way. It isn't Dracula, but apparently now you throw these things out, and then someone will always say, "Yeah, I don't think so." Is what I believe it to be. Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dracula can't be. They were making versions of Jekyll and Hyde in like 1911. Edison Company, I think, made a Jekyll and Hyde. Dracula can't be far behind.
No, there's not for Dracula.
If you say so, yeah, thereabouts. It's kind of a follow-on from the question you're asking. Journalists, generally dumb journalists, will often ask you to justify horror, and I used to try and do it. I used to try and come up with a heavyweight Fraser Crane kind of psychological rationale for horror, and I stopped doing that. If people ask me to do that now, I throw it back and I ask them to justify comedy, and they look at you kind of blankly and they say, "Well, comedy doesn't need justification." I said, "Well, what do you mean? So why do you go to watch a comedy? Because it makes us laugh. So why do we go to horror? Because it scares us, because it gives us that thrill vicariously, because it is a work of imagination, principally. Horror and fantasy walk hand in hand as far as I'm concerned. And comedy and horror are simply two faces of the same coin for me. They're just same aspects of the human condition. And indeed, if you look at comedy closely, comedy is not generally the nice, cozy thing that we tend to think it is. Comedy is very often based on us laughing at other people's misfortune. Comedy can be a very, very cruel beast indeed. They say the oldest gag is watching somebody walking down the road and slipping on a banana skin. Then if they hurt themselves as a result of walking on the banana skin, it's funnier. And if you have a little bit of backstory about the character, which allows us to not quite like him because he's pompous or self-inflated or something, and then he slips on the banana skin, and then he breaks his arm, it's even funnier.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I hit on this a little bit earlier with our attraction, how we mix humor and the scary stuff. And so you mentioned, I never thought of it, that the best comedies, or the comedies that are, I'm thinking of something like, even right now, the Hangover movies that are popular, they're funny because they take us to a place that we would not normally go. And it's that contrast, and it's touching things subconsciously that we didn't know would actually hit. And I've seen it ourselves with our attraction. I mentioned this earlier. When people get scared, there's very quick a laugh that comes after it. You know, it's not a shriek. It's that strange sort of release that happens.
I absolutely agree with that. Not sure I have anything to add to it. And another thing I think the comedy and horror both do is that they shouldn't be fearless. They should explore everything. Nothing should be out of bounds for comedy, and nothing should be out of bounds for horror. Taboo is an area that both comedy and horror are always exploring. You know, the door that says, "Do not enter."
Well, even if I can interrupt, I think of a movie for me like The Exorcist. There's sort of that, to some people, The Exorcist find it really funny. I mean, because there's sort of a weird subconscious thing that's happening.
I have this argument about The Exorcist all the time. Maybe it's because I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the devil. I don't believe in demonic possession. That may sound like a very strange statement for someone who makes his living out of horror films. I found The Exorcist largely ludicrous, I have to say. Spinning heads and green pea soup, and whatever it was that she was trying to do with that crucifix didn't really do it for me. I loved also the stuff at the beginning, you know, it's going on in the attic. Oh, it's rats. Really? Okay. Rats in hobnail boots, I think.
But I mean, that movie kind of hits because there's a lot of, you know, there's the obvious religious thing going on, but there's also sort of subconscious stuff going on underneath. There's a lot of allegory. And I've heard when you talk about Hellraiser, to get into that, I believe your quote was, it's almost a Gibson play. There's a lot more going on than just jump out to a scare.
It's not my quote. I've said it, but I'm quoting Clive. He described it as Ibsen with monsters. Ibsen, Henrik Ibsen. They used to satirize on Ronan Martin's Laugh-In as Henry Gibson. That's who Henry Gibson was taken from. Swedish playwright of domestic, serious, heavy domestic dramas. What Clive was trying to say was it's that Hellraiser is a family saga with monsters and people without their skin on. But it's at its core, that's the tradition that it's springing out of.
And you were working with Clive before the movie started. Can you talk a little bit about that? Not only how you got started, but how you got involved in Dog Company and some of the stuff you were doing then.
Sure. Well, I really got to know Clive just over 40 years ago. In rehearsal for the school play, we both went to the same high school in Liverpool, and we happened to be in the same school play together. He pretty much, that meeting, I would say, was one of the meetings that have changed the course of my life, pretty much. He was already doing his own stuff at school, away from the school play. He was writing, directing, starring in, hand-drawing the posters for his own plays. I remember going to see one of them. He did two. One was called Voodoo, one was called Inferno. So, you know, not his passions had developed pretty early. And he was given permission by our head teacher, principal as you would call it, a guy called Mr. Pobjoy, basically to take over the school hall. And he just let Clive have free rein for a week and excused us lessons, and we just went in and did what we did. The same headmaster at the same school, which was Quarrybank High School for Boys in Liverpool, about a decade earlier, had given a pupil at the school permission to go ahead and form a skiffle band in the school, which was known as the Quarrymen, and I believe he went on to have some kind of a career in popular music. A guy by the name of Lennon, I think it was. So I always think, you know, Mr. Popjoy could rest his head on the pillow, you know. And Lennon was a failing pupil, but he Pobjoy saw that in him and gave him permission to, okay, you're not doing anything else right, go ahead and do that. And pretty much did the same with Clive as well, though he was not a failing pupil, I hasten to add. After school, we carried on working together, basically doing pretty off-the-wall, avant-garde theatre in Liverpool. I mean, and crazy stuff. Productions that we would spend a year rehearsing and then perform once and move on to something else. By degrees, we moved down to London. That was where the Dog Company formed, and we got kind of more organised, and we were performing plays by Clive that are now published. The History of the Devil is my personal favourite among those, but they're all available to buy and read now. But we were kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. We were doing plays, unknown plays by an unknown author, unknown company with unknown actors. And the Arts Council of Great Britain were not impressed by Clive at all. Didn't give us a penny to do anything with, really. We struggled through for about 4 or 5 years. So this is now taking us into the early 1980s. We disbanded. Clive had started giving me some handwritten manuscripts of short stories to read, because he said, I'm trying to write some short horror stories and see if I can make a bit of money out of it. Which seemed to work. Those were the stories that became the Books of Blood. And then a few years after the Dog Company broke up, I was at a party. Clive had a conversation with me in which he said, I'm trying to get a low-budget independent horror movie together, which is based on The Hellbound Heart, his novella, which I had read, and I think there's a part in there that you might be interested in. And that was the first time that Hellraiser had really come into my life.
Now, when he approached you and he said, I have this character, when Clive comes to you with something like that, how much is a process of him saying, here's the character, here's where he's coming from? That is the official Rampage baby, by the way. Does he come to you? There's no one in this room who hasn't wanted to do that. Does he come to you and say, spell everything out, like where the character comes from, or is it more of a collaborative process?
I would say it was a collaborative process, but he had a very clear idea of, very, very clear idea of what he was doing, which was always the case with the theatre as well. He always had a very clear idea in his head, but was always eager to take new ideas on board. He's always taking new ideas on board. I had I was obviously aware that he had created Pinhead. He had literally dreamt him. And he had drawn him, and I had conversations with him about the character. And basically reading the screenplay was where it developed. But he didn't constrain me in what I was doing at all. The only thing he did do, which was kind of quietly nudging me in the right direction, on the first day of filming, first couple of days of filming, between takes, he would say to me, this is great, this is really fantastic, this is great, just take it down, do a bit less. So I would do that, and he'd say, it's great, I can't tell you, it looks fantastic, what you're doing is just do a bit less. And it's a very difficult note as an actor, because you wind up feeling like you're just standing on your mark, doing nothing, moving your lips. And in a quiet way, Clive was saying to me exactly that. Don't do anything, don't emote anything, because you've got that on your face. And when that is going to be on a big screen 20 feet high in a cinema, you don't need anything else. And indeed, the flatter and the deader you are in your performance, the scarier it's going to be. So that really was the main acting note that he gave me.
And you have challenges as an actor, not only with well, I guess I should ask that, especially in the first movie, how long was it taking to put that whole piece on you?
Early on, it was taking about 5 or 6 hours. It speeded up a bit after that, but everybody was feeling their way with the makeup, so it was a long journey.
Does that part of the transformation help you get into a headspace?
Absolutely. At the end of that process, when you basically sat in the makeup chair for all that time, I was firing questions. I was fascinated by the makeup process, which I think helped me. But at the end of it, it's trippy enough anyway when you look in the mirror and you get that back. And I spent 20 minutes in front of the mirror on my own. And I probably found 95% of the character in those 20 minutes. All the conversations with Clive, hours reading the screenplay, perusing the pages of Piercing Fans International Quarterly. Because you have to remember that body piercing was not as prevalent in 1986 when we were making the film as it is now by any means. So I got this copy of Piercing Fans International Quarterly. It was all new to me, people slicing and dicing their intimate body parts. I've said before, I then had the choice, I guess, whether to go down the Daniel Day-Lewis route and do the research and feel the pain in order to know my character, or just let my imagination do the work for me, and I chose the latter route. I had my ears pierced at the time. That was the sum total of my piercing pain for my Pinhead credentials. But as you can see from that, you imagine yourself sitting in a makeup chair and you're looking in the mirror. You see your eyes, your ears, your lips and teeth, and that's it. Everything else about you is gone and being completely taken over by this character. So I just sat there, frowning and raising an eyebrow and then trying a line or two, and I had it. But the makeup process did leave me in a kind of spaced out place, which was not inappropriate. Then aided by the fact that the moment I walked on set, of course, everybody takes steps backwards from you and goes, "Oh my God," which kind of helps the feeling of regal power when everybody is backing away from you as you approach.
Well, yeah. I think one of the things that is fascinating about the character, and you've mentioned this a couple times before in interviews, is the whole nature of the character is that he is essentially silently judging everything around him. He's almost separate from, he is not engaging. He is kind of dismissive of what's happening.
Right, yes. I mean, I think I had been vaguely saying to myself, approaching doing the film, I'm playing a monster in a horror film. As we got into filming, I realized that, of course, the real monsters in Hellraiser are Frank and Julia. And Pinhead is really a judge. He's an umpire. He's not a boogeyman. He's not like Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers or Jason. He's not hiding around corners with the stiletto blade waiting to jump out and get you because you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's a series of steps. You have to have the motivation to learn about the lament configuration. You have to then have the motivation to go and hunt it down. You then have to solve the puzzle. And even then, I think in Hellbound, when Tiffany, the young girl, opens the box, Pinhead ignores her and says it is not hands that call us, it is desire. It's not even just the physical process of solving the puzzle. It has to be the motivation, the emotional motivation coming through the hands. It's that piques Pinhead's interest. And then he likes to stop and have a good conversation. It's, he doesn't then just jump out the box and stick a bunch of hooks and chains in you and rip you apart. He wants to stop and talk and find out who you are and what your fears are. And he wants to know what this soul is and have a savour of it before he rips you apart. Yeah.
Well, and I think it was the same interview. You said something that I found interesting. You said that the original Hellraiser, I believe the quote is, "It's a movie of its time and not of its time." So, could you elaborate on that? What did you mean by that?
I don't know. Well, I think. Well, I'd love to see the context. I think what I was probably saying, and I've been saying this in a way a lot recently because of the whole remake culture. Absolutely, I despise it. I hate it. I hate everything about it. There have been one or two good remakes, but not many. And they've been talking about remaking the first Hellraiser film now for 3.5 years. Still no closer to getting it done, you'll be pleased to know, as far as I can tell. But one thing I've said is that amongst the fans, and I know this because I do a lot of conventions and I meet a lot of fans, and I've been doing that for 22 years now, there is absolutely no appetite for the remakes. And if people were coming to me and saying, "Oh, yeah, I saw Hellraiser, for a movie made 25 years ago, it's okay. But, yeah, it looks like a movie made 25 years ago." Precisely the opposite is true. That it's clear to me that there's a whole new generation finding the film for the first time all the time. And nobody is telling me that it looks dated or saying, yeah, it's not a bad movie for a 1980s flick. It'd be great to remake it now. So it's clear that it's not dating. There's a degree of big hair and shoulder pads going on that tells us we are firmly in the 1980s. But in particular with the Cenobites, they're never going to date ever, and that's part of Clive's genius to have put these kind of universal monsters that could have walked out of a painting by Bosch or Goya straight onto the screen. They are timeless, and if you go and look at Hellraiser in 50 years' time, whatever else may have dated about the film, the Cenobites will not. It was also, I think, a movie of its time because there's a sense in which it's a straightforward slasher film, which was very much the culture at the time. I've suggested you could even take the Cenobites out of the plot. So the plot then becomes Frank being brought back to life by Julia going out and finding victims, bringing them home, beating their brains out with a hammer, and feeding the blood to Frank and bringing him back to life. There's your plot. Works fine. Now you drop the Cenobites into it, and it opens up in 100 different directions and becomes a much more interesting film and slightly against the grain of the movies that were being made in the mid-80s.
There's probably no short answer to this, but...
I don't know. I do know in the sense that if I said I was a horror fan, so I can step back from the whole thing and look at that objectively, and I can do it and say, well, obviously it's resonating. And I could now sit here and talk for another 20 minutes about all the elements going into the character that I think make him resonate with an audience, but I always come back to a bottom line, which is I'm amazed and humbled over and over again by the fact that I would even say this: I think the character is more popular now than at any point in the last 25 years. And I was assuming the opposite would have happened, that by now it would all be tailing away, and precisely the opposite is the case.
With such an international audience, I mean, this was a British film, is there ever certain cultures or certain audiences that you've been surprised that they have really responded to the character?
It's a question I might throw out to you later, if you can tell me why the character resonates so much. I haven't kind of talked to audiences globally enough to be able to answer that authoritatively, but it is universal. There's no question about that. It's as much in the UK as it is here, and in Europe. It's a curious thing in Europe, though. It's almost like there's a Protestant-Catholic divide. The Protestant countries, predominantly, not exclusively, but Germany, Holland, Belgium, and to a lesser extent, France, very much into their horror. Germany, really into their horror. Belgium and Holland, really into their horror. Maybe it's because Germany is really into its heavy metal. Whereas in Spain, in Italy, I've never done a convention or a signing in Spain or Italy. Not that the audience isn't there, it absolutely is there. And I have had fan mail from right the way across Europe, from Russia, from where they can't get hold of the films. They have to get hold of them still in bootleg versions and on the black market, and I've had fan mail from all the stands, and from troops stationed in Iraq who tell me that Hellraiser is hugely popular and that it's always being demanded to be screened, like they haven't had enough hell already, which is amazing to me as well. From Australia and New Zealand, from Japan. It is global. I've seen posters from Africa. I've seen posters from Thailand, from Malaysia. It is absolutely everywhere.
Has there been any one moment that for you was particularly surreal, or an action figure or a tattoo or something where you just realized, it really started hitting home how much of an impact this character has?
You mean apart from the guy who wanted me to sign his name?
I think we've all had that moment.
I'll leave your private life out of this, Scott. I declined, by the way. I think I told them I wasn't sure I'd be able to fit it on. And then paused because I thought, I have no idea how far off his meds this guy is. Maybe wisecracking might not be a good idea. He just went, "Oh, okay." Turned around and walked away. I had a set of ceremonial chopsticks sent to me from a Shinto princess in Japan. There are probably hundreds, but I'm blanking on them at the minute. The Pinhead doll with supposedly my interchangeable head, when I had a bit more hair than I have now. That looks like Phil Collins. Thrilled with that moment.
Well, let me get back to the process real quick. When you were talking about how you find the character, and you mentioned DayLewis, who's famous for being very, very method. Is that your approach? Do you stay in character all day, or once the camera stops rolling, are you turning it off?
Look, it's horses for courses. I don't wish to be mean to Mr. Lewis. Everybody It's whatever gets you through the night, whatever gets you through a filming day. I think that kind of thing, the tales we heard from There Will Be Blood, which I think should actually have been retitled There Will Be Pauses. That
was good. Sorry.
I didn't like the movie, and I think I think he sucks the oxygen out of films. It's me acting. And the tales that he apparently refused to allow them to launder his stuff because he was working in the oil wells all the time, so he had to be smelly, and he wouldn't speak to people. And there is an actor who I think personally is a far greater actor than Daniel Day-Lewis can dream of being, and that's Robert Duvall. I think Duvall is one of the greatest who ever drew breath. He has that wonderful gift of being great in crap. Not that he's done a lot of crap, but he has, and even in bad movies, he's really good. He apparently is famous for, you'll be on your marks, about to do the intimate close-up. And even while the first AD is giving the countdown, this will be pictured very quiet all around, roll camera, roll sound, speeding. Duvall is in your face going, so, you see, they just delivered second meal. It's Domino's pizzas again, for God's sake. We had pizzas 3 times this week. Action. Cut. I mean, for God's sake, if I eat another pizza this week... I am more there. I leave the work in the office, and I would go mad, frankly, if I had to try and do that all day. It's difficult enough carrying that makeup around all day. And I think you all know that the average movie day is roughly 10% working and 90% sitting around waiting, if you're lucky. And that's difficult enough if you're wearing a very expensive Armani silk suit. You're walking around with this on for 12 hours. It plays with your head. It really does. You just want to be able to take it off and put it down and just be, Doug for a couple of hours. And then I'll put it back on and be Pinhead again when you need me to be. But you can't lose it. It follows you around. People don't quite react to you because they're reacting to that the whole time. I can't cope with being in my own company when that's on. I can't cope with being around a lot of people. And I discovered in conversation that Robert Englund had exactly the same reaction when he was wearing the Freddy Krueger makeup. And we both found that we did the same thing. We became nomads. We just wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered. But no, I'm not someone who would try to be Pinhead all the time. Or I don't like this business of first ADs and directors refer to you by your character name. As some actors, if you call them Daniel on set, they won't answer you. They won't respond. They'll only respond if you call you by your character name. It's pathetic, frankly.
Well, it's
just a job. It's just a job. It's just a way of earning a living. That's all it is. It's only like being a bricklayer, but the rules are slightly different.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Duvall, because just as Clive told you to play it down, I think his best performances are not the big, showy, look at me, and by lowering his voice, he kind of controls the conversation. He makes you pay attention to everything he's doing.
How brilliant is he in The Godfather? And there are all these huge characters and huge performances going on all around him, Brando and Khan and so forth. And he hits the note of the consigliere absolutely, and he's just quietly there all the time, quietly there all the time, and he becomes, in the second film, he is absolutely Michael's confidant, And as brilliant as Pacino's performance in Godfather Part 2 is, and I think it's his greatest ever performance, I have no idea why he thinks it's Scarface. It's Godfather 2 for me. Duvall makes that performance, is partly responsible for making that performance as great as it is, because he's just this quiet foil to Pacino all the way through the film.
And I do agree with what you're saying about Daniel Day-Lewis. It is about the communication between the other performers and the other actors.
I'm sorry, Daniel. I didn't want this to turn into an attack on you. I'm sure I'll love you greatly if we get to work together. Carry on.
Well, and my last question I want to ask before I turn it to you guys, you might have some questions. You're still a horror fan. What are some movies or TV shows or books that are exciting you recently?
I just saw Insidious, which I liked. I've seen some pretty skittish reviews of it, but I thought it was really clever film. It actually scared me, and that's not common, I have to say. Go back on the remake thing. The remake of The Crazies, was that a couple of years ago or last year? I thought was really, really good and better than the original. I've been watching some Korean and Japanese movies. There's a really good, I think, Korean vampire movie from last year called The Thirst, which I would hugely recommend. Really liked that. And Steph, my girlfriend, and I, we spend a lot of time watching movies through Netflix. And when I'm back in London, we don't get Netflix. We have Love Film, which is the equivalent of. We watch movies together transatlantically through Skype. It's brilliant. Isn't that lovely? Share full screen. So we, and there's a movie we just found. It's an Australian movie called Angst. Has anybody seen that? Isn't it great? Might be the best portrayal of a serial killer on screen, I think. Really disturbing, but really, really, really powerful, really good film. So I'm still finding stuff as well from the 1960s that I never caught up with first time around. So new movies, old movies, and everything in between, still catching them. Looking forward to seeing Don't Be Afraid of the Dark when that comes out. I'm all about Del Toro as well. So. Sorry, I was just talking about us watching movies transatlantically. It drew an ah.
All right, so Doug can answer some questions. I'll go with BB in the back.
Most of the people in this audience are actors in the haunt, or they hopefully will be actors in our haunt. What resources do you recommend for developing a horror-themed character?
Wow, okay. Number one, this imagination. If that isn't there, you can't do it. And that's true of all acting, not just of horror, but specifically with horror. I mean, I've always said, partly when people talk about preparing for the role of Pinhead, how do you do that? There are no pinheads, there are no Cenobites, they don't exist. There's nowhere I can go to do the research, to watch a Cenobite at work, as far as I'm aware. If anybody knows differently, please don't tell me. So that kind of, whereas you might want to go and watch a traffic cop on duty so you can learn how they do their thing, you can't do that with this. You can't do it if you're playing an undead or a vampire or skeleton or whatever it is you're required to play in a haunted house. Me personally, looking at art has always been important, and images lock in your head and they come back to you, but it's always principally about your imagination. And the point that I described of me looking in the mirror, that's a point that you're all going to get when you've got your mask or your makeup on. Remember that although you're still you in your head, when the outside world is looking at you, you're not you anymore, you're this. So I would recommend spending time in front of the mirror, learning what it is you look like to the rest of the world, and what works and doesn't work in relation to your makeup. Is that the kind of thing you were? Okay, all right.
Matt?
You said that you still love horror films. What would be your number one all-time favorite horror film then? Besides your own.
No, it's not. I would put Hellraiser maybe in the top 20, but my favorite horror film of all time, it's by no means the scariest, but it is, for me, still the granddaddy of them all. It is 76 years old this year, and it's The Bride of Frankenstein. I bracket Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein together. Karloff wrote the rule book. James Whale's direction and art direction is extraordinary. They still rule the roost for me.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned humor, because Bride of Frankenstein certainly has
Plenty of
dry wit.
Pretorius with the little homunculuses in the jars, King Henry, and fantastic. Yeah.
Do you have, and I'm not saying this as a setup, do you have people at conventions say this line?
Oh, sure, yeah, yes.
Are you going to make them do one?
I'm not going to. Yes.
You could try, but I'd have to tear your soul apart.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your work with the development of your one-man show?
Sure. Always been fascinated by death. Always been, really, really terrified and obsessed with death as a little boy. So it kind of grew from there, and it's a portmanteau show. It's a collection of pieces by other writers around the subject of, which I have then structured together with the help of a very close friend of mine who was in the dog company back in the day, and is actually in Nightbreed as well, Mary Roscoe. She helped me compile the show, and she directed the show. So it has a sequence from The Hellbound Heart of Frank opening the box for the first time. So Pinhead is in there briefly. I have a piece of Ray Bradbury from Dandelion Wine, The Ravine. Huge Bradbury fan for as long as I can remember. There's Shakespeare and Walt Whitman and A. Houseman. Some poems, a piece by a wonderful writer called Thomas Lynch, who is an American funeral director and poet. So it's about 75 minutes long, and I've been performing it over the last 5 or 6 years, mostly at colleges and universities here in the States, but I am just in the early stages of looking at the possibility of reviving it, initially right here in Pittsburgh. I don't know whether you're aware, but I am planning to make Pittsburgh my home. Exactly when that's going to be, I'm not quite sure yet.
How about why?
How about what word?
Why?
How about why Pittsburgh? She's standing out there.
There is no way we're going to be able to top that. So I'm going to have you guys all give us a hand for that.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the ScareHouse Podcast. We'll be featuring some other speakers from Scare Camp in upcoming podcasts, so be sure to subscribe. ScareHousePodcast.com is the website, and search ScareHouse on iTunes. I'm your host, Rob Johnston. Thanks for listening.